I am definitely resuming in Matthew, as practically always. So here in Matthew's fourth section, which I have titled with a summary statement that Jesus has disciples who believe the signs, while the opposition becomes more stubborn. So again, tracing for the next several chapters until about the middle of chapter 16, this growing divide that Jesus is causing really as he goes about his ministry. And right now we're going through the latter half of this fourth section. So we're after the parables. Now we're in a bunch of stories, which I've called stories of disciples and doubters, because again, you see both kinds of people taking their stand in one direction or the other with regard to Christ. Now today, in this passage, we're coming to the most important miracle of Jesus' ministry. And I've worded it that way deliberately. I plan to justify that claim in a few minutes, but I do mean to say that it is, I consider, the most important miracle of his ministry. So let's read verse 13 through 21. This is the feeding of the 5,000, of course, but starting in verse 13, and it's picking up after the death of John the Baptist, that is. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So, I don't know, sometimes my titles are a little arbitrary or maybe generic, but I titled this message "The Great Sign of the Giving Savior," because I figured that summed up everything well enough. And really, the sign, it says a lot, so trying to jam it all into one statement is kind of difficult. But my extended statement, to give you my summary of what we're trying to get here as we read this passage, the sign basically says this: that Jesus is more than a prophet, that he's the Messiah, that he brings a new exodus, to use that term that I've used several times, and a new exodus in which he will give with self-sacrificial compassion. There are a lot of ideas in there. You're kind of getting the idea for why I consider this the greatest sign of Jesus' ministry, because there's a lot going on. He says a lot here by doing this miracle. And my outline, really, I'm just trying to walk through those ideas in a step-by-step fashion and try to do justice, as much justice as I can in a short time, to all of them. So I have 5 things really to talk about, and they really just walk through everything I just said in that extended statement that I gave. So first, I just want to talk about how Jesus provides his ministry's greatest sign in this miracle. I want to justify that claim here at the beginning to some degree, just so we're sort of on the same page moving forward. Then secondly, point 2, that Jesus exceeds the image of a prophet. That it's actually not a good thing to call Jesus a prophet to some degree. It's kind of cutting him short. Thirdly, that Jesus lives out the expectations of the Messiah, the expected King of the Jews, and all the things that were hoped in all of that. Jesus lives those things out in this passage. Fourth, that Jesus brings a new exodus for Israel. Kind of the most abstract of the points, but important from a very biblical perspective. And I think important to see these things when they come around. And then finally, the fifth thing, that Jesus gives with self-sacrificial compassion. So chasing down a lot of different ideas, but they're all here to some degree, and I really want to try to make them all plain to you this morning. And if you want a binding idea to move forward, I have a rhetorical question really just a rhetorical question because the answer is obvious. But the rhetorical question for the rest of the sermon is it a good thing that Jesus has all power in heaven and earth? Again, very, very much a rhetorical question. You know the answer, but that's sort of the guiding thought for the rest of the message, because the goodness of power depends very much on what you do with it. You have a bad person in power, things don't go very well. You have a good person in power, things go pretty well. It all depends on what you do with that power you have. Today's passage may very well be the best brief image of the authority of Jesus and how good it really is, that he has that authority. It's probably the best brief image that I can think of, the more I look into this passage and all that it says. So I will hopefully show you that it is indeed a good thing that Jesus has all power in heaven and earth. Hopefully this passage will convince us of that. You know, if you've not already been convinced, I'm pretty sure you have been, but in the very least, that's generally where we're going. So to begin with this first point that I have, that Jesus provides his ministry's greatest sign in this miracle. Now, I very, very often try to stay away from comments like that try to talk about the greatest of something or the most important point or that sort of thing, just because really, I mean, everything we're talking about here with regard to the gospel and with regard to the Christian life is so important. It's hard to put things, you know, in a ranked order sometimes. But in this case, I think we can. In this case, I think the conclusion is justified. With the exception of his resurrection, the feeding of the 5,000 is the greatest sign ever performed by Jesus, I would say. The resurrection, of course, is more important just because it is the crux of our salvation. But if you look within his ministry, that is from the time he turned 30 and started going around preaching up until his arrest, if you want to make that the end point for his ministry, if you look into things that Jesus, was doing as he was going around ministering, I think the feeding of the 5,000 qualifies as his greatest miracle. And I want to make 4 points for this, that this is his greatest sign. First of all, this miracle is so important that it was worthy of an encore. It was worthy of a kind of repeat. Because not much later in Matthew, and the same is true in several of the other Gospels, not much later in Matthew's Gospel, we're going to encounter a very similar miracle, which is the feeding of the 4,000, in which generally a lot of the same things happen again. So it's an encore, it's kind of a repeat. This sign of Jesus feeding multitudes miraculously was so important that it needed to be done again. One time wasn't enough. Whatever Jesus is trying to communicate here as he does all this, it was so important he needed to do it again, not too much later. So first of all, that it's worthy of an encore, I think is significant. Secondly, this is one of the best witnessed miracles in Jesus' ministry. When it comes to how many eyes saw this, this is one of the best. You see, Jesus has this habit of doing his miracles in secret. Even when he's healing somebody, he prefers, it seems like if possible, to go into a room or go away somewhere and do these sorts of things in private. He just does these things privately, and I think there are reasons for that, but generally, that's how he does it. Well, in this case, at least 5,000 people saw this miracle. And if you didn't catch that, it's 5,000 men, besides women and children. So there's even more people. We don't know how many women and children there were, but there's a lot of people, at least 5,000. Even the resurrection, as important as that was, had only 500 witnesses. You say only 500. Well, 500 witnesses is important. I mean, you go there to where some of these authors in the New Testament talk about that. The greatest number you see is that many. Well, I mean, it's still not as many, not by a long shot, as the feeding of the 5,000, where you have 5,000 people who saw this happen. And really, Matthew, he indicates to you where you could go to find these witnesses. I mean, it's around the Sea of Galilee. He sort of says, go up there, walk around the towns up there around the Sea of Galilee, and you'll find some old-timers that can tell you about the day they saw Jesus multiply food miraculously. And then you'll walk down to the next town and you'll find another one, and another person, and another person. A lot of people saw this in this one concentrated area. It's almost like a source citation. You want proof that Jesus did this? Just walk up there and ask people. It's a very important thing when you have a lot of these miracles done in secret that you have some of them done so openly. And this is one of the bigger ones of that sort. This is one of the best witness miracles in Jesus' ministry. Thirdly, one that is sort of interesting to talk about, it sounds like a true story, which I say that knowing that there are plenty of skeptics that automatically give a thumbs down to anything miraculous. But just focus for a moment on how true stories and false stories sound. See, fake stories are very generic. They're like, years ago, there was a man in a big city, blah, blah, blah. And it's just, you almost like you get these things in your email sometimes, and you're reading them, it's just like, this is fake. You're 3 sentences in, somebody just made this up. It's not a real story because they don't have that ring of authenticity. You see, in real life, our minds latch on to these strange details and these things we experience and these things we see. Just obscure stuff, totally by accident. You're not trying to remember them, but you just do. And when you tell those stories, those details come out. You remember when you first met somebody, you sometimes remember what they were wearing. You remember what they had on. Sometimes you remember what you were eating when you heard a certain piece of news. Just weird, random stuff. Our memories latch onto that. And when we tell these stories, those things work their way into the story. That's some of these things that just they're part of the authentic nature of a genuine account. Well, in this story, you have some of those same kinds of details. Does it really matter that there were only 5 loaves, 2 fish? Wasn't it just enough to say they didn't have much food? But no, it was like, I remember, we had 5 loaves, we had 2 fish, and there was some green grass on the ground. And at the end of it, we had 12 basketfuls left over. It's like, you don't really need those things, but that's the way a story sounds when it's real. That's the way you tell a story when you're relating something that actually happened. So just going along with the impressive count of witnesses, in terms of authenticity, it sounds like a genuine account. So anyone reading this, if they give it a fair shot here, it sounds like something that someone actually remembers happening. But the fourth reason, and the big reason that I consider this the greatest sign worked by Jesus during his ministry, is that it is recorded in all 4 Gospels, which is not a very common thing. I'm going to give you a list of events here, okay? Just a list of common events. You know about them from the life of Jesus. Here you go. Birth of Jesus. Jesus' baptism. His transfiguration. His ascension to heaven. Now you think about those things, and those are big events, right? These are extravagant things. These are important things. They also have something else in common, and that is that various gospel authors are silent about them. Not every gospel author mentions the birth of Jesus, which is very strange. Not all of them mention his baptism, his transfiguration, his ascension to heaven. Not all of those things get mentioned in every gospel. We have 4 gospels, and they leave out plenty of stuff by their own decision. Huge events in the time of Jesus simply don't make it into all the accounts we have of Jesus' ministry. In terms of miracles, there are actually only 2 that make it into all 4 Gospels. One of them is the resurrection of Jesus, very obviously important. The other one is the feeding of the 5,000. So you have to talk about these signs that Jesus did that the Gospel authors thought, this is so important, it has to be mentioned. There's only 2 of them. Just 2. The resurrection and this one, the feeding of the 5,000. All the others of them, maybe you include them, maybe you don't. Maybe some people will care, maybe some people won't. They don't necessarily matter. But these 2, the resurrection and this feeding of the 5,000, this matters. They have to mention it. In terms of miracles, it's very unique in that respect. Somehow, the gospel authors came to the conclusion that this sign was so important, so integral to understanding who Jesus is and what he does, that they had to put it in there. They didn't have an option. Somehow the lessons learned from this story are so important that not one gospel author dared leave it out. So for all those reasons, especially that last one, but for all the ones that I've been talking about, I do consider this the greatest sign worked by Jesus during his ministry. It's number 1. So here in this section of Matthew's gospel, which stresses the signs of Jesus and his disciples believing those signs more and more, he has recorded for us this greatest sign of Jesus. Almost like the centerpiece of this section in a lot of ways. Now, what do we learn from this sign? You talk about this, you say, it's the most important sign Jesus did. It's like, okay, well, why is it so important? Why is it that none of the gospel authors dared leave it out? Why did Jesus do this in front of so many people? Why did he do it, in a sense, do it again a little later on? Why? I mean, what's the point here? Well, start moving through these ideas, you start to see just how important the miracle actually is. Moving to my second point here then, that Jesus exceeds the image of a prophet, which is just to say that he's more than just a prophet, which is an incredible thing. I mean, prophets are important in themselves, but more than just a prophet. I mean, other men are just prophets. Jesus is more than that. That's the first thing to learn from this sign, and that is that you should never insult Jesus by treating him like a prophet, because that is actually to cut him down rather than lift him up. Now, when you think about some of these prophets from the Old Testament, it's very interesting that two of them, at least, were known to do miracles that multiplied food. There are other accounts, therefore, in the Bible of accounts where people have taken food and miraculously made more food. Those prophets were Elijah and Elisha. I just want to read some of the accounts of them. There are three, actually. Starting in 1 Kings, you have chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. And really, I'm just reading these. There's no real extensive comparison. Not really need for an extensive comparison because Jesus is so obviously different than these guys. But 1 Kings 17, verses 8 through 16. This is Elijah in this story. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah. He said, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink." And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." And she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little jug of oil. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go and prepare it for myself and for my son, that we may eat it and die." You have to remember they're in a famine right now, so there's not a lot of food, not a lot of water. So they're going to eat their last meal and die, basically. That's their plan anyway. And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." And she went and did as Elijah said, and she and her son and her household ate for many days. And the jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. So you have a multiplication of food. I mean, they had enough for one last meal, and now it lasts until the end of the famine. So you have this kind of thing happening. You can go further to the life of Elisha, 2 Kings 4, verses 1 through 7. You see a very similar kind of thing. Now the wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, "Your servant my husband is dead, and you know that your servant has feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." And Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what have you in your house?" And she said, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels and not too few. Empty vessels and not too few of them." So get a lot of empty vessels, okay, basically. Kind of a strange way to word that, but there you go. Okay, then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons, and pour into all these vessels. And when one is full, set it aside. So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons, and as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. And when the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another." Then the oil stopped flowing. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest." So here you have one jar of oil, and they just keep pouring it into all these other jars until they're all full, and now she has enough money to basically pay off this creditor so her sons don't have to be slaves. You have a multiplication. Very similar. One more story like this, also from the life of Elisha. Chapter 4, also in 2 Kings, verses 42 through 44. a man came from Baal-Shalishah, bringing the man of God bread and the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain, fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, "Give it to the men that they may eat." But his servant said, "How can I set this before 100 men?" So it doesn't sound like they have enough there. It's kind of strange. So he repeated, "Give them to the men that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left." So he set it before them, and they ate, and they had some left, according to the word of the Lord. So again, you don't have enough food, but God makes it enough in this story. Now that last story is probably the one most similar to what Jesus does, in that you have bread and a group of people there, and now you're going to multiply this bread to feed more people than it really could have fed without a miracle going on. However, that story and all the other stories we just read really do fall far short of what Jesus does, which is my point, that Jesus exceeds the image of a prophet. You see, the old prophets, they fed a household here and there on occasion, and sometimes a small group of men, right? You don't get the idea that there's a lot of people. At most, it seems like in that last story, there was 100 people there. Okay, Jesus, 5,000 men, and then women and children, however many there were. We don't know how many there were. So Jesus feeds 5,000 plus people, which is way more than any of the prophets ever did. And then the feedings of the prophets were done in obscurity. Even in that one story, there was the woman supposed to shut her door when she goes in there and multiplies this oil. So there's just not a whole lot of attention here. Well, Jesus, again, as we said, 5,000 people all saw this happen. It was undeniable. There was no way you can go up there and talk to the people living around the Sea of Galilee and doubt this fact that Jesus multiplied food. It wasn't done in obscurity, it was done openly. And then on top of it all, Jesus fed the 5,000 after he healed all their sick. So after having spent a lot of energy, to some degree, doing all these miracles already, Jesus then does another miracle that again outshines what the prophets did before. So these two great Old Testament prophets, Elijah and Elisha, are completely outclassed by Jesus in this miracle. Yeah, what they did was great. What Jesus did was greater. It was bigger and better. Now this observation would have been very important for that crowd of 5,000 people. This is very much a point that Jesus is trying to make. You see, to Matthew's later readers, or Matthew's readers, and well, here, let's just stop there and let's go back to Jesus' ministry. Back in Jesus' ministry, people had a lot of ideas about who Jesus was or what Jesus was. You can see this a little later on in this same fourth section, chapter 16, verse 13. When Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is? Who am I?" Well, they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." So you take a public poll of people at that time and ask the question, who is Jesus? What is he? The dominant answer is that he's one of the prophets. Maybe he's the prophet John the Baptist. Maybe he's the prophet Elijah. Maybe he's the prophet Jeremiah. Maybe he's one of the other prophets. None of the above, but one of the prophets. It's just like people had this idea generally that Jesus is one of these old prophets come back somehow. It's just a really strange idea, but nonetheless, that's the idea they had. So you think about that, and it's just like, well, people are thinking Jesus was a prophet. And you think about maybe Matthew's readership several decades later, were some of those ideas still around? Were people still talking about Jesus, saying, that guy Jesus that was killed all those years ago, do you think he was anything? Do you think he was maybe one of those prophets come back? That sounds possible to me. You have people talking this way, probably to some degree still talking that way later on. And just the question is, who is Jesus? Is he one of these prophets? Well, the answer is no. He's not one of these prophets. And how do you say that? Well, because when you look at his deeds, it's far greater than any of those prophets ever were. Okay, so Elijah, let's say Elijah came back. Well, when Elijah did his miracles, they were relatively small miracles. He never did anything like this. Neither did Jeremiah. John the Baptist, I don't think, did any miracles. Not that we know of. So how can you look at Jesus and explain him by saying, well, he's one of the old prophets? Doesn't make any sense. Jesus so outshines the old prophets, it doesn't make any sense to say he's one of them come back from the dead. It's a strange idea anyway, but even stranger when you look at what Jesus does. To call Jesus a prophet returned from the dead is actually to diminish his glory. It sounds like an important thing. Hey, one of the prophets came back from the dead, but it's actually far short of what Jesus actually is. When you say those kinds of things about him, you're not giving due credit to the glory he has. And miracles like this show you that. So as we look more carefully at the deeds of Jesus, such as the feeding of the 5,000, the sign says he's more than a prophet. You can't explain him by just saying, well, he's one of the prophets, or he's like one of the prophets. It doesn't work that way. You can't say that about Jesus. Not when you seriously consider the things he was doing. He's just greater than a prophet ever was. Okay, so say Jesus is more than a prophet, so what is he? Okay, what is Jesus actually? Well, my third point here is that Jesus lives out the expectations of the Messiah, of the King of the Jews, which I'm sure is no surprise to you. It's the bedrock of your faith, but still quite a novel idea back in Jesus' ministry, this idea that he actually was the Christ. Let's go back to that question that Jesus asked his disciples in chapter 16. Now the question is, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they start listing off all these prophets, or say, well, maybe he's one of the prophets. And Jesus says, but who do you say that I am? So that's the question. So who is Jesus really? And of course, Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So part of this fourth section of Matthew here is that, again, while the opposition to Jesus is growing more stubborn, you have his disciples growing in faith as they see these signs. The disciples see the signs of Jesus and they believe in him. So throughout this section, if you want to think about it this way, Peter has been thinking about these signs, right? He's seen Jesus do all this stuff. And he's been thinking about that. And his conclusion to all of that is that Jesus is more than a prophet. Everyone else in Israel is saying, oh, Jesus, he's Elijah. He's Jeremiah. He's John the Baptist, even though that doesn't make any sense. He's one of the other prophets. But Peter, he doesn't see it that way. He's been thinking about these signs, and he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's the Messiah. He's the one anointed with oil. It's a very kingly title, this idea of being anointed for kingship. That's who Jesus is. According to Peter, his estimation of the situation is that Jesus is this great king descended from King David who is coming finally to rule Israel and the whole world on behalf of God in a never-ending kingdom. That's what Peter has concluded thinking about all these signs that he's been seeing. Now, the feeding of the 5,000 is a great sign for the messiahship of Jesus. I think there is a direct connection there between this miracle and the conclusion Jesus is the Messiah. I think we're meant to have that conclusion. And to show you that, I'd like to go back to Psalm 132. Now, this psalm focuses very much on the promises made to King David and the blessings that God would give to Israel through his sons. So it is very much messianic. King David was supposed to be this king of Israel from whom would come the Messiah. The last great king who would rule the world. And Israel, of course, but the whole world along with it. So this psalm, very important for ideas regarding the Messiah. The Messiah is supposed to fulfill these things when he comes. So let's read part of this. Psalm 132, verses 11 through 18. Just want to read the last part of it. The Lord swore to David a sure oath, from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and my testimonies that I shall teach them, their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. For the Lord has chosen Zion, he has desired it for his dwelling place. There is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provisions. I will satisfy her poor with bread. Her priests I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy. There I will make a horn to sprout for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but on him his crown will shine. Okay, so there you have these great promises. One of them was there, I don't know if you realize it, but I will satisfy her poor with bread. I will abundantly bless her provisions. Now, just snap out of your American mindset for a moment and realize that for most of history, and even right now, much of the world, a lot of people don't have a lot of food. And that's certainly how it was back in the ancient world. I mean, you worked every day just to get food for that day. I mean, it wasn't guaranteed you were going to get it either. I mean, you might go that day without food. You might go the next day without food. So one of the things you want in your great king is that he'll satisfy you with bread. Am I going to have enough bread? Am I going to have to worry about whether I'm going to eat tomorrow? Am I going to have to worry about whether I'm going to eat today? So you got to remember, back then, this promise, huge promise, I will satisfy her poor with bread. So one of the expectations that the Jews had, probably one of their greatest expectations really, was for a king to come who would bring an abundance of food. Well, here in this great sign performed by Jesus, he fully satisfies the hunger of 5,000 people miraculously. He satisfies the poor with bread. And just to get that word in there, satisfy, verse 20 it says, and they all ate and were satisfied. I mean, you just think about this here. Were they sitting there thinking, oh, that's the best meal I ever had. I have a full stomach. I'm satisfied. And then does their mind go back to this promise? You know, I will satisfy her poor with bread. And do they think to themselves, this might be the king. This might be the Messiah. And of course, if you read John's gospel, you see they did come to that idea. But we're not in John, we're in Matthew. We're going to limit ourselves to this gospel. But you have this promise. Jesus comes, seems to fulfill it. It's like, this is a man who can satisfy the poor with bread. Don't underestimate the impact this would have had on that crowd. Again, remember, this is probably the first time a lot of these people have ever eaten to their satisfaction. They probably haven't had a full stomach like this before. The idea that they're now sitting there with enough food, they have food left over, they're throwing scraps in these baskets as they're being passed around. I mean, this is amazing. This is huge for them. And they have Jesus to thank for it. And they have every right to think at this moment, this man is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He has done exactly what they expected the Messiah to do. So this feeding of the 5,000 is a great sign for the Messiahship of Jesus. Now, of course, you think about this and you get to realizing that it's all very temporary, right? In terms of the ministry of Christ. Because for just a few years, really, in Palestine, you see these great things. You see, the poor satisfied with bread. You see these healings. I mean, you see Jesus do these amazing things and then he's gone, right? I mean, it's just not this permanent thing. He's doing a lot of stuff powerfully in every corner of the nation for a while. And yet all that went away. And today, you have a world of poverty. You have disease. You have lies. You have falsehood being spread around. I mean, it's just, you have the ministry of Jesus, this great thing for a very brief while, and then we go back to business as usual, and it's not nearly as good. But that ministry of Jesus, and this is the point I'm trying to make here, was very much a brief glimpse of what God would eventually give to those people who trust Christ, who would trust this man is indeed the Messiah. This is what they're going to get. It's going to be like this. In showing these signs to people, Jesus gives people a chance to believe not just that he was another prophet, but that he actually is the Messiah, that he's going to bring these things. This is more like a glimpse. It's more like a flash forward. Jesus gives you a chance to see what you can have if indeed you follow him. So you see here what it's like for Jesus to be the Messiah. And this actually goes into my next point, this new Exodus idea. Not just that Jesus is more than a prophet, not just that he's the Messiah, but this idea of something very specific that, again, was very much from Old Testament expectation about the Messiah. And that is that this Messiah was going to bring a new Exodus for Israel. Now, in a sense, again, I'm still talking about Jesus as the Messiah. I haven't really changed topic. This is just a more specific idea within that topic. Just this idea of the new Exodus that I have mentioned before. It does seem kind of obscure, maybe a little bit irrelevant to talk about it this way. But when it comes down to it, it really depends on how much you care about freedom from slavery. Do you want masters over you that rule harshly over you, or do you want to be free from all of that? That's basically the idea of the new Exodus. And it's why this idea comes up so often in the Old Testament. And let's just trace this. Okay, so the Exodus. Let's talk about the Exodus, the original Exodus, Israel leaving Egypt. In Israel's history, That was the great act of salvation. You know, we talk about salvation as Christians, we're talking about very much a spiritual idea. You talk about salvation in ancient Israel, they think deliverance from our enemies. Okay? Basically, that's what's going on back then. That's the way they think about it. And there's no greater act of salvation in the history of Israel than the Exodus out of Egypt. Don't forget they were slaves, okay? No freedom. You know, you have this brutal oppression going on to where they cry out to God for deliverance eventually. Not a good thing. God raises up Moses to lead them out of Egypt. You know, after 10 plagues and that sea crossing, Israel finally is free. They're free of their slave masters. Now, due to their rebelliousness, of course, Israel had to wait 40 years before they could go into the new land that God had in store for them. And of course, in that time, they're in a desert, right? They're in the wilderness, which means a desert over there in that part of the world. Over here, a wilderness is like a forest, but over there it's a desert because that's what they have over there. So they're out there in the desert all that time until they eventually do get to go into the promised land. But of course, in the wilderness, God is still good to them, right? He gives them bread from heaven, the manna, you know, the angel's food, as they might call it, right? So they give them that bread. There are healings out there. You have these incidents where those, snakes come and bite them, and they have that bronze serpent set up. There's healings out there in the wilderness. We think of this time in the wilderness as a time of discipline, and really it was, but even out there in the desert, God was good to them. So you have this deliverance out of slavery, and then you have God's provision for them in the wilderness. All of that is the Exodus. And overall, you have this time when God was very, very good to Israel and worked great power among them. Now, that very much then becomes, in Israel's mindset, the great act of God's deliverance for Israel. That's how they view it. Now, that Exodus, and this is the point I'm trying to make here and that I've made before, that Exodus is not the only Exodus which God had planned for His people. That's not it. There is another Exodus coming. It's been some time, but I have discussed this in the Matthew study, this idea that in the Old Testament prophets, they very much portray the future salvation that God's going to work for Israel using language like Exodus. They talk about things like redemption from bondage. They talk about streams in the desert. Right? Remember when Moses brought forth water from the rock and it's gushing out and now millions of people can drink? Streams in the desert, very much an Exodus idea. Talk about securing their own land. Right? Well, the promised land was very much part of the Exodus idea. And of course, you have this God-appointed leader that's going to make it all happen. There's going to be a new Moses for this new Exodus. These kinds of ideas show up very often in the prophets in the Old Testament. So really what you're waiting for is a new Exodus. And even in the New Testament, although you might not think of it as a very prominent idea, it does show up from time to time where this new Exodus language does get used to describe what Jesus has done. And my point is, in the feeding of the 5,000, you get some of that. So all that to say, we're talking about the new Exodus in this passage. The feeding of the 5,000 looks like a mini Exodus. It's like a smaller version of that great event. It begins with crossing a sea. Did you notice that Jesus and His disciples use a boat to cross water at the very beginning of the story? So Jesus and disciples arrive by boat, and then we have this huge crowd of people, 5,000 plus, kind of like the multitude of Hebrews coming out of Egypt, right? A whole bunch of people out there. Also, did you notice that the men are counted? They somehow knew there was 5,000 people. It's kind of like all those censuses that they did back there in the wilderness. Did you notice that only the men are counted? Did you notice that in the censuses back in the Exodus, the women and children aren't counted? Very similar, same kind of thing. Also, where is this crowd? They're in a desolate place, which again over there is a desert. Okay, they're out there in this kind of desert area. It's a wilderness, kind of like back in the Exodus. And what's the first thing that happens? Jesus heals their sick. There are healings out there, like the occasional healings that happened during the time in the wilderness for Israel. Again, back from the Exodus. And then you have a miraculous provision of abundant bread, kind of like the manna coming down from heaven. Well, in this case, it's the multiplication of the loaves. So you have that kind of thing. And then you have, of course, this nice little detail, the 12 basketfuls of bread right? 12, like the 12 tribes of Israel coming out of Egypt. And finally, the big thing is that you have one man who's responsible for all of this. You have a new Moses out there presiding over all of this, making it happen. You have Jesus. So you have all these details when you start to think about them. This is like a mini Exodus. It's like a smaller version of that event. So when Jesus does this sign, he is very much, again, sending a message. The message is this: the new Exodus is starting. It's happening. And I am the one bringing it. When Jesus does all these things, very much casting himself in the role of Moses out there in the desert, giving food to a multitude of people, he's very much saying, I'm starting this new Exodus that you're wanting. It's starting now. And of course, it's one thing to make a claim that you're doing that. It's another thing to prove it by actually doing it, by actually doing some of the things that these people expected. Very much living out this Exodus image right there in front of them. So this sign says that Jesus is more than a prophet. He's the Messiah. And as Messiah, he is beginning to bring this new Exodus. This thing that they've been expecting for so long is starting. Now we come to the major point here, the fifth point that I have, that Jesus gives with self-sacrificial compassion. And to some degree, this is where we finally get into the details of the passage. I haven't really been doing that too much, but right now we finally get to. Now, the whole image of a new Exodus, as I've been saying, is a very positive image. It's about freedom from slavery. It's about God providing for you. It's about God taking care of you. Very good ideas. But the feeding of the 5,000 takes it all so much further. When you start dissecting the details, there's a lot here that just shows you just how good it was to be there with Jesus at this time, as really he ministers to you, as he serves you. It really shows you how good it was. In these final details, then, I want to show you, I think ultimately, why this miracle really does have pride of place. All these things that really do make it the quintessential miracle sign of Jesus. So let's just go through these things. First of all, you see the compassion of Jesus. And you see more than just the word, you see the idea. Let's start here in verse 13. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So, thinking about this, again, a little further, that Jesus still feels compassion at all, I think is an amazing thing. Because this guy has seen crowds of sick people constantly around him all the time for a long time now. I mean, that's basically what his life has been. He wakes up, crowd of people need healed, I heal them. Go to bed, wake up the next day, do the same thing all over again, and again and again and again for probably a year and a half now, just based on a general estimate on where we are. Okay, that's basically been his life. Now, you would think by now he'd be kind of numb, right? You get to the point where you see enough people in misery, it doesn't have the same effect on you as it once did. You kind of get a little bit callous to it. That Jesus still sees these people and feels this surge of compassion for them is a pretty incredible testament to his character, just the depth of his compassion. The fact that he still feels that sense of mercy is amazing. But beyond that, remember this. What's happening in this passage? Jesus is trying to get away. Why did he go to a desolate place? Why would you go to a desert? Because there's no one out there. You want to get alone for a while, okay? You want to be away from all these crowds. I mean, you just heard that John the Baptist got killed. He probably wants to get away for a while, so he goes out there to this desert. And what does he see when he gets there? A crowd of people waiting for him. All of them saying, gimme, 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 basically. That's what they want. They want to be healed. So they go out there to find healing when Jesus was trying to find some time alone, and now he has to heal all these people. I mean, that's like going on vacation just to get called home on day one because there's some crisis you have to deal with. It's not what he wanted going out there in the desert. But still, as he sees this crowd, rather than feeling frustration or insisting that they all go away, he feels this surge of compassion and he heals all of them. I mean, it's enough to make an ordinary man frustrated, but not Jesus, because he's not an ordinary man. He's a man of extraordinary compassion. And you see this in this passage. I mean, he had these plans to get away, scrapped them all. Now he's going to help these people. It's amazing. Go a little further with this, verse 15. Jesus, the giving of Jesus, it has no deadline. It has no cutoff point. Verse 15. And now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." So, it's evening, the day is now over. Okay, this is the time of day when everyone is supposed to go home and mind their own business. You get home after a hard day's work, or you've been working all day. Now it's time for my things, okay? It's time for me and the things I have to do. Everyone else is outside the walls of my home. Nothing else has to bother me today. Well, that's how it's supposed to be. Now, Jesus, he's worked hard all day. I mean, he's been healing these people. How long do you think it would take to heal however many sick people 5,000 people have? I mean, presumably they've all brought somebody, right? So there's a lot of people there. He's been healing all of them all day long. You know, he's earned a little bit of rest. Now that evening is here, maybe now we can finally get some rest and relaxation. And yet, it was when the day was over and the day's work was done that Jesus does an even greater work than he did before. You know, and he was healing all these people. Now he's going to feed them all miraculously. So at the time when he should actually stop working, he actually just keeps on going, which is, again, an amazing testament of the kind of person he is. He's the kind of guy that if he had a cell phone, he would never turn it off because he's worried someone might call him who needs his help. So Jesus never turns off his cell phone to speak. I mean, he keeps on going. Even long after, no one would expect him to keep going at this point. The day is over. The disciples are saying, let's hang it up. They're like, yeah, it's a good idea. We've been working hard all day. It's time to send everyone away. Jesus is the one guy saying, no, we have more work to do. He just keeps going. Speaking of the disciples, another point, that Jesus gives even when other people fail. Even when people stop giving or don't give, Jesus gives. Now, I don't necessarily like picking on the disciples, but I'm going to do it now because I have to. I think it's in the passage. The disciples, they have their own plan here to feed the crowds, and you see that there. You know, this is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves. That's their plan to deal with this problem. Now, that is a terrible plan. Okay, bad idea. This is not good. First of all, there are at least 5,000 people here. Okay, 5,000. At least 5,000. Now let's do the math. Let's say they all broke into 5 groups. So 5 groups of 1,000 plus each. Now let's say they all went each to their own village or town nearby. You know, they each picked a town nearby and they went there. Do you realize that's at least 1,000 people descending on this town randomly at night asking people to feed them? I mean, what if here in Hannibal just a multitude of people came walking down the street saying, feed us, feed us? I mean, that's not a good situation. That's terrible. That's a bad idea. On top of that, these crowds have been making this journey in the dark. I mean, the day is over. I mean, it's starting to get dark out there, and now they're going to go walking. It's just like this. The disciples' plan just isn't good at all. Now, that's the first failure of the disciples. I mean, they come up with this plan, kind of calloused against the needs of these people, not really thinking it through how to best help these people. That's their first failure. There's another failure here, and I don't think it's very often mentioned, so I want to give it some attention. And that is the disciples fail when Jesus proposes a different plan, and that plan is actually for the disciples to feed the crowd. Okay? Jesus' first plan here is for the disciples to feed the crowd. Let's read it, verse 16. But Jesus said, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. You know, not I will give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. And then they said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. And that's the disciples' response. Now, think about that. Don't read too quickly over it. We think of this miracle as Jesus feeding the 5,000. It could have been the disciples feeding the 5,000. That could have been how this story was told. It could have had a completely different ending, a completely different plot. Now don't forget, these disciples, they've done miracles. Did you forget that? Back in chapter 10, Jesus sent them out 2 by 2, healing people. I mean, they have done what Jesus was just doing. Jesus heals this multitude of people. The disciples could have done that. I mean, they've done miraculous stuff before. God has enabled them. I mean, they're not completely without spiritual power, if you want to talk about it that way. Jesus implies in telling them, you give them something to eat, they could have done this. They could have been out there multiplying the bread. They could have been multiplying the fish. Jesus could have sat back, got the rest he deserved by this point, and let the disciples handle it. It could have happened that way. Jesus says to them, you give them something to eat, and what do they say? We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Whew. They don't get it. I mean, they see only the limitations of the moment. They don't get the idea that God could actually provide here if they would maybe have a little more faith. They don't get that though. They see only the limitations of the moment, and that's their second failure. They could have done this wonderful miracle, and then they didn't. They just didn't go through with it. So Jesus, however, I mean, that's when he steps up, right? He still feeds the crowd, which is why I say Jesus gives when others fail. I mean, the disciples, they have this terrible plan. When Jesus implies that they could actually do something better, they just kind of balk at that idea, and then Jesus steps in and does what no one else could do. So even when everyone else around you is failing, Jesus is still the one giving. Now there's one more detail here in this passage worthy of mention, and that is it's a foretaste of Jesus' self-sacrifice. His eventual death for our sins. Now, I'm going to jump here to another passage in Matthew that you might perhaps think is related, but I think it's even more related than you might realize. Where are we here now? Chapter 26. Chapter 26, verse 26. Okay, so later in Matthew, we're going to read the account of the Last Supper with Jesus and his disciples, where we get the idea of communion. The bread and the cup being used as symbols of Jesus' death, the breaking of his body, the pouring out of his blood for us. Very much this is where we get this idea. We do this nearly every Sunday. It pictures for us what Jesus has done to save us, which is self-sacrifice. He gave his own body, he gave his own blood. Okay, now let's read this passage and let's notice some of the terms used. Okay, chapter 26, verse 26. Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And we'll just stop there with the bread part of it because that's all that really matters for what we're doing right now. So you have these terms here. Jesus took, said a blessing, broke, and gave to his disciples. That's the imagery. He took, said a blessing, broke, and gave. Okay, that's what happens here in this Last Supper. Now, let's go back to the feeding of the 5,000, and let's read a scene from here, and let's again pay attention to the words being used. Verse 19, "Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds." So Jesus took the bread, said a blessing, broke the bread, and then gave it to the disciples. Same 4 basic points, right? You see the same wording in this story as we're going to see later in the Last Supper. They are basically framed the same way. They have the same skeleton. Matthew portrays this miracle of feeding the 5,000 as a kind of communion before communion. The language that you associate most directly with the Last Supper and the communion ritual that we do, so to speak, that's the language Matthew uses in talking about the feeding of the 5,000, which is why I call this a foretaste of Jesus' self-sacrifice. You see the same basic idea that you see later on in the Lord's Supper. So this salvation that Jesus works is, of course, the act of one man having compassion on a huge number of people, meeting all of their needs, even at his own expense. Is that a fair summary of what you've seen so far in the feeding of the 5,000? That salvation is the act of one man having compassion on a huge number of people, meeting all of their needs at his own expense. Jesus is doing that. And to put it all a little bit further, you have this sort of pre-Lord's Supper going on here, in which Jesus very much exemplifies the breaking of his own body and giving it to these people for their benefit. You see this foretaste of his own self-sacrifice. I call the feeding of the 5,000 the greatest sign ever worked by Jesus for a reason, because it is the greatest picture of the salvation worked by Jesus. I mean, it's one thing to have a table of 12 guys and Jesus takes bread and breaks it and says, "This is my body." But he did that earlier for a multitude of people. After healing their sick, after he was really trying to get away to begin with, long after he did everything he would have been expected to do, he does more. That's what Jesus is doing out here. And it's a great image of the salvation worked by Jesus, totally pouring himself out for others. The feeding of the 5,000 shows that better than any other miracle that I think we have recorded, which is what makes it the greatest miracle worked by Jesus during his ministry. So to come back to that rhetorical question I gave you, is it a good thing that Jesus has all power in heaven and earth? Well, let's return to that question. Is it a good thing? Who could bring a rational objection against a king who rules for the good of his people? Okay, there are a lot of kings that don't do that. But there are some kings that have done that. There are no objections to those kinds of rulers. Well, if we have any doubts about the goodness of Jesus as king, we have this miracle, right? I mean, we see here what happens when these people show up and what he's going to do for them. Basically, he just gives. And he gives and he gives and he gives. Long after he really could have stopped giving to some degree in terms of worldly expectation. I mean, you see here what kind of king he is, the way he treats his people. And if you want to contrast that with something else, Matthew has, and not just Matthew, but Matthew has put two stories together that are kind of interesting, because we have this other king of the Jews having kind of his own banquet just before this, right? Last time when I preached, we talked about Herod's banquet. I mean, what happens there? I mean, he throws a party. He has all of his friends there. He exploits this girl, makes them dance for the crowd. Then he cuts off this prophet's head. I mean, that's what happens when some kings throw a party for people. When Jesus has a banquet, he just gives and he feeds and he heals people. I mean, that's what Jesus does when he gets power. We talk about, submitting to the lordship of Christ, obeying, topics like that, and they sound very stuffy. They sound very religious, okay? There's nothing stuffy or even really religious, you could say, about this story. It's not about, following rules. It's not about going through the motions. This here, you have this crowd of people, needy people, out there in this desert. They need healing. Later, they need food, and Jesus just gives. I mean, that's the picture that we are presented with. That's what it's going to be like. That's not, you kind of wish lost people would see this. It's not the way you think it is. Becoming a Christian, getting converted, being saved, it's not. We use these terms and people have these ideas with them, and they just think it's going to be a bunch of just joyless, boring garbage. But it's more like this. This is the picture given to us. It's more like being out there in a desert. You're sick, you're starving, and here comes this man, and he heals you and feeds you, and not just you, but 5,000 other people. I mean, that's what salvation is like. Who could object to that when you view it that way? But it's just like, you want to make people see it this way, but so seldom do they actually see it that way. That's what the kingship of Christ is like. That's what it is to submit to Christ as Lord. I mean, you're not under somebody's thumb. You're there with someone that's providing for you, that's helping you. I mean, that's strengthening you when you're ready to fall over. That's what it's like. And that's why the feeding of the 5,000, I think, is such a prominent sign. That's why I think all four gospel authors included it, because it's such a clear image of what Jesus does for people. I mean, we talk about how these signs, represent spiritual realities, and that's true. I think you see that here. So much of what it means to be a Christian, so much of what it means to be saved by Jesus is right here. What more could you want in terms of a miracle showing what Jesus does for people? It's an incredible sign. And so, I mean, I just think that's why it's the ultimate sign for the four gospel authors, why they all include it, and why I think it's so important. Okay, well, let's summarize all that. Really, I just had 5 points. First of all, that Jesus provides his ministry's greatest sign in this miracle, which really has been sort of the chief idea. Secondly, that Jesus exceeds the image of a prophet by doing more than any prophet ever did in terms of these feeding miracles. Thirdly, Jesus lives out the expectations of the Messiah. If you're looking for someone that can, supply the needy with bread, Jesus is your guy. Fourthly, Jesus brings a new exodus for Israel. I mean, you see this sort of mini exodus idea out there with the feeding of the 5,000. Just a testament to what Jesus is going to do and what he has planned for those that will trust him. And then finally, that Jesus gives with self-sacrificial compassion, which is seen throughout this entire miracle so clearly. So, you might say that Matthew has provided us with this story at just the right time because we haven't seen much good stuff lately. I mean, you have Jesus goes to Nazareth, gets a really poor reception there. Then you go to Herod, and you just see sin destroy this guy, just totally lay him waste. I mean, it's been kind of a downward spiral so far. But then Matthew comes in here. He tells us this story about Jesus, showing you so clearly what he does, what kind of man he is, what kind of king he is. This great sign. And the disciples saw this. It's one of the things that they're filing away in the back of their mind. Things that they have seen Jesus do. When any other man would have given up, when any other man would have been powerless, Jesus does this. And they're seeing just a greater revelation of his glory. And they're getting to the point where they're eventually going to say, with Peter, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You see here the reason to believe otherwise, the reason not to fall into the hostility and the opposition that everyone else is. Anyone who was there had such a great reason to believe this man and follow this man. There was no excuse for doing otherwise. I mean, it's just a very powerful miracle. Why would you not be a disciple after seeing this? I mean, why would you not follow him? Why would you not believe the sign? Anyway, that's the feeding of the 5,000. Again, just a very powerful sign. I think it deserves top-notch mention in talking about the miracles of Christ. Are there any questions or comments on this?